Meet a man who knows how to get to the truth. Coming up next on Carolina People. Good morning. Welcome to Carolina People. This morning we're at the Fox 43 studio. We're focused on journalism in action, and we're visiting with Paul Gable, a writer and the sports writer for the Myrtle Beach Herald. Good morning, Paul.
Morning, Greg. How you doing?
Thanks so much for coming in. It's so exciting. I've been wanting to get you in for a while and just to break down some of the basics. You know, Tom O'Dare's been with us, and of course Betty's been with us, Debbie Harwell and Steve Porter, and I think we're pretty well covered the basis for a small community paper like the Myrtle Beach Herald.
Well, you've got a nice staff. You've got a nice reputation. And one of the comments I get as we go around and talk to people is that they think that we do a very good job on local news. They read us for local news, it's even fair to say predominantly in a lot of instances. Yeah, those are the kind of comments I get.
Well, that's fantastic. You know, it's so exciting. Donald Smith, who you and I, a mutual friend who owns Lucky Dog Television, had called me right after I purchased the paper and said, you got to get in touch with this Paul Gable. He's going to be an important asset. Of course, I'd seen your writings in the Orient Independent and the Loris scene there, and exciting to see you've been a community journalist now for, it looks like, about 5 years.
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, with a weekly newspaper, you fill a niche, I believe. And we're not going to cover national news, we're not going to cover international news, but we can do a very good job on local and community news if we do it right. One of the advantages we have a week to prepare it. I mean, you can research a story for a week. One of the interesting things about that is that, of course, you have less staff on a weekly paper and what have you. We probably write as many stories, and in a lot of instances maybe more, as if we worked for a daily newspaper where they basically do one a day. But we do have the time to do more research, maybe take a different angle, maybe take several angles. And we can give a more complete picture if we do the job right. That's the belief that I have about it anyway.
How about yourself, Paul? Are you originally from the area?
No, I've been down here 20 and a half years, so I guess that kind of makes me a native by
you're
now,
a local.
or close anyway.
Right.
But I'm originally I was born in Pennsylvania, and I grew up in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Moved down here from Boston.
How long were you in Boston?
I was 6 years.
Is that right?
6 years from Boston. That's where my wife's from. That's where my first child was born. The other two were born down here. And Boston's a city I love. I mean, I just love Boston.
Yeah,
you know.
It is. There are a lot of Dunkin' Donuts in Boston.
Well, I mean, interestingly enough, at one time, I worked with the man who was a cousin of the man who founded Dunkin' Donuts.
Is that right?
Now, you want to hear a success story? The guy I worked with, he had a different business altogether. He used to write the letters and the correspondence for the guy that owned Dunkin' Donuts. Because the guy that owned Dunkin' Donuts was basically illiterate. Not stupid, but he couldn't read and write. So he could write his name. So Phil would write the letters for him. He'd come over and sign them. One time Phil said to him, doesn't it make you feel bad? He said, nah. He said, I hire a couple of them smart guys from Harvard to do the reading and writing and what have you for me, except for personal correspondence. He said, but they don't know how to make money. He said, I know how to make money.
Oh, wow. That is a good success story. That is a good success story. How about growing up, you said in Pennsylvania, was there anything that, when you think about your youth, you think about some of the activities you used, what are some of the things that stick out in your mind?
Growing up, sports. And one other thing. I remember my first trip to the school library. We did that when I was in the first grade. And from that point on, I was in love with books and reading, especially history, but a lot of other things. But history, the main thing. But I'll never forget that, and I've been a very steady user since, you know. And my father was in newspapers.
Is that right?
He was on the advertising side, but he was in newspapers. And the first real job I had was after my freshman year in high school, and I was the cleanup boy around a newspaper.
In Pennsylvania or New Jersey?
In New Jersey. We moved to Jersey right before I entered high school, entered ninth grade. And so I went through high school there. And of course, we moved around as he moved around. And the daily newspaper racket, especially in the beginning, there's a lot of moving in order to more money, get a title, that kind of thing.
Golly, that must have been exciting. And he would come home and talk to you about that?
Oh, well, I mean, he used to take me into the paper, too. I knew the people. You know, my father was he liked to have one of the children go along, and I was the oldest, and so I got to do those kind of things quicker than my sisters did. And I used to go along with him on Saturdays and stuff, and I can remember the old days of hot lead, when they punched out the newspaper on a linotype machine around the computers like we use today, and what they had to go through if they were going to make a change. And I mean, we can do a lot more things with the front page than they used to be able to do, you know. But I can remember all those things. In fact, he taught me how to mark up the ads. And with classified ads, you had stuff that went until further notice, and then you had other stuff that had certain dates. I used to mark up the pages for him and stuff. And I met the writers and the editors and what have you. But I had a good time talking with the writers. I mean, you know, it was a very interesting time. And like I say, I was a freshman in high school, so I was old enough to at least converse with them reasonably and what have you.
Sure.
And yeah, I mean, it was something that I think once it gets in your blood, it stays in your blood. It took a deferred position for a long time for me, but it always laid in the back of my mind.
Right. Now, later in high school, you went on to college there in New Jersey?
In Jersey, yeah.
Right.
Monmouth College.
Did you write it all there?
Nothing other than term papers and what have you. I did do a senior thesis on what I called the Second 100 Years' War, which at one time I thought I might publish, and now sits in the back of a filing cabinet at home, you know, and I still take it out occasionally and look at it, and it's fun.
Yeah.
Of course, it's all post-dated. It was the time of the Cold War and what have you. I mean, I always liked to write. I always liked to write, and I had fun writing. And but as far as making a profession of it, no, not at that particular time. It just didn't cross my mind.
You went into the military, Paul.
At Richard Nixon's behest. Well, I mean, I went to work for Bell Labs after I got out of college, and I spent 2 years on Kwajalein Atoll, which is the Kwajalein missile range. We were working on the old Safeguard, the first anti-ballistic missile project. And we were, you know, Bell Labs was you don't know, but Bell Labs was the overall contractor. They were the prime contractor for it. And I spent 2 years down on that island at 6.3 square miles. It was about the highest point. It was about 3 inches above sea level, except for the missile silo we built there. And I'll be honest with you. See, engineering was a major. One of the good things about that was I learned that engineering wasn't my bag because it just bored me in the actual field. And I'm glad I learned that. I had a job deferment. I went down there in 68, and Nixon's lottery in 1969, he had a draft lottery. New Jersey canceled all job deferments, and my number came up. So.
That's fascinating. I think I saw on a little piece you'd put together for me. Thank you. Military intelligence from 70 to 80.
Yeah, well, one of the things is, you know, I had a clearance for working on what I did with Bell Labs.
Right.
And I went into the Navy just to go in and get my 4 years over with and get out, you know. And when I went in, when I got to boot camp, they had openings in naval intelligence. And so they asked anybody who wanted to be considered for it to, you know, sign up and go have an interview. Of course, first thing you're told is never volunteer, but I did. And one of the biggest problems, of course, is getting a clearance. Because regardless of what you might hear and regardless of what you might see leaked in certain areas, there's a heck of a background check that goes on that. So already having had a clearance, it was somewhat easier, at least. There was some background check already done on me and what have you. And I wound up with a top secret, a lot of code word access and special access and all that kind of business, and saw stuff that was, you know, interesting.
That's fascinating. You know, our tech director, Keith Setries, had some level of security clearance. I've heard him talk about the experience in the Navy and the excitement of course, he was on submarines, I think, for a long time, but the excitement of being involved, and surely for you, that aspect of some of the codes and other, I mean, it's a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, you see some stuff that at times you don't believe. One of the ones that I do remember the most was, and this, I don't remember the classification on it. It wasn't national defense per se important, but I was on duty the night that, a couple weeks before Nixon resigned,
Mm-hmm.
And we had a message come across that said, no military units, repeat, no military units will move on the orders of the President unless countersigned by the Secretary of Defense.
Wow.
Now, they weren't sure. It didn't play out, but they weren't maybe sure that he wasn't going to try and keep himself in with a, somewhat of a coup or what. I looked at that, and I was overseas. I said, what in the heck is going on back there? This is nuts. This isn't America. But you saw a lot of interesting things like that. But also, that's where my writing came back into fore.
Mm-hmm.
Because what I wound up doing was writing an awful lot of briefing documents, intelligence reports. I was the intelligence briefer for the command, so whenever we had visitors come down, I'm the guy who gave the brief, and I'm the guy who took the grief if they didn't agree with the brief, which happened a lot. But, my writing probably started to blossom at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, that's the way I write now. I mean, my son is in journalism school. I have never been to a formal journalism school or taken a formal journalism class.
Mm-hmm.
But what I did involved getting facts, putting them together, determining what was true and what wasn't. Of course, in the intelligence business, that's, you deal with a lot of stuff that is false. You got to filter the false out of the true, and put together briefing documents for an admiral who was a pretty tough guy.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted his information and he wanted it right. And I use the same approach now, quite frankly. I don't write news articles a whole lot different than I did intelligence reports.
That is very interesting. That must be one of the greatest parts about being a journalist, is that aspect of really searching out the truth and making sure that you work every avenue possible to find it.
Yeah, an important thing, I think, and something that should be mentioned for everybody, we are guaranteed by the First Amendment the right to be a business. Mm-hmm. We have free press, freedom of the press. So we're one of the few businesses in America that has a guarantee from the Constitution that we can be.
Mm-hmm.
But with that comes an obligation to be fair, to present two sides whenever possible. Sometimes the other side won't comment. And being fair doesn't mean being bland. It means presenting the facts as they are, as the best of your ability to do it. And one of the basic tenets, of course, is you don't go with anything if you don't get a confirmation behind it. Somebody tell you something, you get one, preferably two confirmations, that kind of thing. You try not to tell anything from one side. You have that obligation, but you have an obligation to be fair. You have an obligation to present both sides, and you have an obligation to present facts. Mm-hmm. Now, columns are different. You write a column, that's an opinion. You can say anything you want to, anytime, because that's your opinion going out there. Mm-hmm. But when you're writing a news story, if you're not factual, you'll hear about it. And you should. Mm-hmm. And it's your obligation, to be fair. Present both sides.
I remember when you and I met there at the Atlanta Bread Company up there on 76th, and and of course I was asking you as part of that to tell me some folks who don't like you, who have found out you weren't any. Said I think you made very clear you may find some folks who don't like me. You're not going to find anyone who said that I wasn't fair in my coverage of an issue.
Yeah. Well, being a journalist is like being a coach, is like being a politician. Sometimes it's thought that if you have 50% of the people for you and 50% of the people against you, when you've written a story, you've done the right job. Mm-hmm. But you're certainly not going to make everybody happy all the time, and you shouldn't try. Mm-hmm. And, in all honesty, it's sometimes to get a story, to get facts, to get questions to the right people, you make a nuisance out of yourself. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There's people who get sick and tired of seeing you. Mm-hmm. But if you're doing the job right, that's what happens. Mm-hmm. So, you're not out there trying to win friends and influence people, but you're trying to be honest in what you report. Right. And there's people around this county that will tell you that they would prefer there's things that I didn't write, that I hadn't written some things that I did. Mm-hmm. But one thing I'm proudest of is nobody's ever had to ask me for a retraction of something I said.
Yeah.
There we go. I've had people complain about stories. Mm-hmm. I've had one or two try and stop them before they got printed. But they could never say that there wasn't anything in there that wasn't true. Mm-hmm. It wasn't for that reason, it's that they didn't want something to get out.
Right. That's a very good point. A college professor said, Craig, I don't care how thin the pancake gets, there'll always be two sides to it.
Always. And the other thing is, going back again to newspapers for a second in general, mm-hmm. we are the public's eye. Mm-hmm. There's very few, if you go to a county council meeting, you go to a state government session, up in the federal government. It makes no difference to city council. Very few people attend.
Mm-hmm. You're right.
You know, it's to me that's sad, but it's what happens. And so they look to us to provide them with what's going on. And if there's money spent wrong, or if there's an unpopular project maybe that's going on, and we report it that way, then we're going to make people mad who are making those decisions.
Mm-hmm.
But that's life.
Mm.
The public looks to us to present them with the facts, and that's what we try and do.
Speaking of that, Paul, you know, we always hear about FOIA, or Freedom of Information Act. How does that affect the everyday citizen? I mean, you're speaking about some of the important aspects of really getting into things, but the Freedom of Information Act comes into effect quite a bit on some major, I know we followed that series of pieces there in the Sun News regarding Limo and Benedict Shugaloo and some of those issues, and FOIA became a very important aspect of that.
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, I have my own Freedom of Information Act general request in with Limo, of which I'm getting some stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The Freedom of Information Act was put in to make public access to everything that goes on in government. The concept is that government should be open to the people. The two basic restrictions you have are something that's got to do with a legal issue.
Right.
And that is even more specific to prior to a decision being made,
right,
to get a legal briefing, or if the city, county, whatever governmental institute it is getting sued or is suing somebody, up until the time it's filed, they can keep that private, or a personnel issue. And generally with a personnel issue, it's basically whether a person's being fired or not. Now, governments, in all honesty, will try and keep as much secret as they can, in my opinion. When you file a Freedom of Information Act request, there's 15 days for them to answer. Not to provide the information, just to give you an answer whether, yeah, we do have it or not. And unfortunately, a lot of times, not a lot of times, that's an unfair statement, but sometimes you actually have to go to court to force it out, which, talking about Limo, the Sun News, in fact, did. That gives a perception that people are trying to hide things, whether that's true or not. An awful lot of times, government would prefer to clean up their own dirty laundry in private. But that's not the American way. So freedom of information is an important tool. It's a tool that some entities will force you to use to get any information. Limo, interestingly enough, they wanted it on record because of the search warrants and what have you that were issued, but we're very open with giving information. I mean, they haven't been restrictive at all. They're a lot nicer than some other entities I've dealt with.
Right. Paul, when did you and your wife first meet?
We met in January in 1979. I was still in the Navy, and we knew each other we got married in July of 1980, so what's that, a year and a half that we knew each other. Spent a lot of that time going to Celtics games and Red Sox games and what have you. Yeah, I mean, that was one of the real benefits of being in Boston. You had the professional sports teams, and at that time it was cheap. We used to spend $2 or $3 for a bleacher seat to go to the Boston Red Sox, which is now about $30, I think.
Wow.
And $7 or $12 to go to a basketball game. I don't know if you touch that for $75 these days. You know, it was a fun time.
Yeah, that must have been.
And
nice.
when we used to go we used to go all over the city. And the rest of the state. I mean, but the city of Boston, we had an awful lot of fun in.
Is she a native of that area?
Yeah. She's born and raised Boston Irishman, so.
Wow.
You know.
You said y'all's first child was born there, and I remember, of course, reading that piece you did leading up to the area Heartball on March 6th. There was a great piece you had a couple days in the paper before that about the experiences of your son with born with a heart defect. Can you share with the viewers a little about that who may have missed that piece?
Yeah, he was born with what's known as transposition of the great arteries and also a large ventricular septal defect. And what that means is his arteries on his heart were reversed. So that rather than having a complete overall pumping, the right ventricle pumped to his lungs and back into the right atria. I mean, the right atria pumped to his lungs and back into the right ventricle, and the left from his body and back in the left. The blood never mixed, it never purified, except for the big defect between the ventricles at the bottom. That's what allowed him to live, frankly. When they took his first blood test, it was quite purple.
Wow.
So we knew that. And it was an interesting year. He spent a year in the hospital in essence, not quite that much, but it seemed like virtually the whole time. My wife was up there with him. It was Children's Hospital in Boston, and they had provisions of a sort for parents. They had cots that you could sleep on at night and what have you. And she stayed with him 5, 6, 7 days a week. Sometimes, well, most weekends I'd go up and get her for a day or so. Just, you know, she'd have a break away from the hospital. But that went on for just about 10 months. And then everything got fixed up right. He had some major surgery, had some problems afterwards, but then he wound up getting a scholarship on tennis to college. So.
Oh, come on.
Mm-hmm.
He went from that at birth to being a tennis player now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what happened was he had a surgery that was only a couple of years old. His is called a Senning procedure. Before that, they used something they called a mustard procedure. And those names come from the doctors that invented them. Mm-hmm. And the mustard procedure didn't work very well. By the time children got into their teens or early 20s, they had problems. I'm not familiar with exactly what they did in that mm-hmm. situation, but I know that the growth was stunted, and they didn't have a long lifespan. Well, his was about 2 or 3 years old when he had it, so we had no long-term prognosis, you know. But it involved a different situation where they literally cut the heart open and restructured things and used the valves as they were, but then restructured where the valves pumped to. So his heart pumps crosswise. Mm-hmm. And the arteries were left as they were, so that the ventricle that normally pumps to the lungs at low pressure now pumps to the body at high pressure. And so there was a lot of stabilization had to go on, which caused us a lot of our problems in the mm-hmm, first year. Mm-hmm. But the thing is that the heart made the adjustment. You know, the body adjusts to almost anything, and in the younger it occurs, the better it adjusts. Mm-hmm. So he's grown up with a heart that's not normal, but is normal to him. Mm-hmm. A heart that's different, but functions normally for him. I mean, his blood pressure is usually around 120 over 68 or something like that. His resting pulse rate is around 60. He's got a great athletic heart, and yeah, he started playing tennis, and he's a tennis player.
That's great. And you all have 2 other children?
2 other girls.
2 other girls, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So a boy and 2 girls. What's the best part about being a dad, Paul?
Oh, there's a lot of rewards. You know, there's a lot of rewards. Children are one of the most wonderful things that can happen to you. From the time, like I was in for the birth of all 3 of mine too, yeah. Right in the delivery room, which was a fascinating thing. And you know, you're given this little life, and you have a very big influence in its development, and you see them grow, and you see them do things, and you see them get older and start to make their own decisions, and you don't agree with some, and you do agree with some, and if you're lucky, they come to you for advice. And, you know, but I always say that, you know, really, we have children to have them leave us. I mean, that's what we do, to grow up and be responsible adults and to move on and set their own pace in life. But I don't know, they're just about 1,000% reward. I mean, they really are.
Wow, that's great.
Not always, you know, don't get me wrong, we've butted heads, there's no doubt about it, but they're really great. Yeah. They're really great.
That's wonderful. You all moved down here in '83. You were in the hospitality industry for almost 15 years mm-hmm. before becoming a full-time journalist. What that old itching, either from the naval days or from cleaning the newspaper, your dad in general, pulled you back in?
My son did.
Your son did? My
son did. When he was in the 6th grade, he had a teacher, and I'll be honest with you, I forget her name. It was over Myrtle Beach Middle School. Uh-huh. And she convinced him that he was a good writer. And so from that time on, he decided he was going to be a journalist from the 6th grade. And actually, he started writing letters to the editor and stuff, and got a few published in the Sun News when he was in middle school. Mm-hmm. And then as a freshman in high school, he got a job at the Lauracine for sports. Mm-hmm. And when Steve Robertson bought the paper, and he used to write high school sports, that's how he started. And then he branched out into other things. And when Steve Robertson bought the paper, he went through a couple of full-time people quick, and he asked Paul if he knew anybody who would be interested in writing for him. And Paul said, yeah, my father. Mm-hmm. So we worked together.
That is great. Mm-hmm. The 2 of y'all, Paulie Gable, senior and junior.
Well, actually, the 3rd and the 4th. I'm the 3rd, and he's the 4th.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, we've kept that on. But yeah, we worked together for a long time. We were the only people that wrote for for the scene. And I think the greatest thing, you ask about being a father and what have you, one thing I knew was Paul. If I asked him to do something, he'd do it. If I couldn't cover something, I needed somebody to cover it. I trusted him completely to go cover it, because I knew that he would come back with accurate information and what have you. And it was, I mean, we used to bounce stuff back and forth. We'd work together on a lot of stories.
Oh, golly, Paul, we got less than a minute. I was just thinking about that aspect for your wife, having grown up in Boston and now living in Loris. For you all, I mean, and of course you haven't spent much of your life in a big town. What's that like now, living in Loris?
Quiet.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing. There's not a lot of traffic. Loris is a great little community. You know, eventually Loris is going to grow. And I lived in New York City suburbs, and we lived together in Boston, right in the city. And that probably won't occur in my lifetime out in Loris, but we lived in Myrtle Beach to begin with, and we moved to Loris because we wanted the peace and quiet of the country, as opposed to I'd had my time with driving in traffic, quite frankly, routinely. It's a great little town out there, nice and quiet and peaceful.
If you weren't currently writing full-time for the Herald, what do you think you'd be doing, Paul?
That's an excellent question. I don't know. One thing I tell you I wouldn't be doing is working midnights anymore at hotels like I did for years. I did that for a specific reason. That's because that way one of us could always be with the kids, and we didn't have to deal with child care or what have you. And I did that for a long time, and it got very tiring, and I got very burnt out. And I wouldn't be doing that. And that's not a negative. It's just I think that's a young man's game, and I'm not a young man anymore, you know. But I think I'd probably be writing somewhere, because it was time to get back into this and have fun.
He'd find a way to keep writing. And that love of a son who's provided that inspiration to help him get back into business. The excitement is constant. It's amazing. The journalism aspect keeps you going, and it surely kept Paul Gable going very strong. Paul, thanks so much for being with us this morning.
Greg, thank you, too. It was fun. It was a ball. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Stay tuned to more Carolina People with Paul Gable coming up next. We want to thank Paul Gable and those early childhood inspirations, whether he's cleaning up a newspaper or actually writing for one. The difference he's made in journalism is a special one.